Welcome to Arts and Humanities Are Central. I'm Margie Morgan, Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, and your host for this exploration of the important role that the arts and humanities play in our everyday lives. My guests today are Professor Heidi Szpek of the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, and her husband Frank Idzikowski, who's a senior adjudicator with the Veterans Administration in Seattle, and I believe also a military historian. Is that correct?
Yes.
Welcome to Arts and Humanities Are Central. Thanks for being here. We're focused today on a book produced by Heidi and Frank, and also Heidi's brother, Irvin Szpek Jr. The book is entitled Shadows of Slaughterhouse Five, and it's the recollections of American POWs who were held captive in a public slaughterhouse in Dresden when that city was bombed at the end of World War II. One of those POWs is Heidi and Irvin's father, Irvin Szpek Sr. Another, of course, is Kurt Vonnegut, who wrote about the experience in Slaughterhouse Five. I wonder if we could start by just telling us some basic facts about your role in producing the book. I mean, who did what? Who did the writing, the interviewing, the editing?
Heidi's brother, Irv Jr., and I gathered material from these men. We located and contacted as many as we could. We interviewed a considerable number over the telephone, spending anywhere up to several hours at a time. Some of them provided written memoirs, some provided just letters, others, the next of kin, provided information, what little information they had. And we had collected this over a period of years by going to conventions, POW unit reunions. And then finally, Heidi said, this is taking too long. You need to do something with it.
So you kept people on task.
Yes, I did. I stepped in, and he used to call me. He says I was kind of like his sergeant back in the military. But I realized the years had been passing by. This is over 10 years. Many of the men who originally gave memoirs had passed away. So I said, it's time we put this in book form. I asked Frank to write an introduction as the military historian. My brother's a little more casual and folksy in style. He wrote the afterword to describe the project itself. And then I gave the structure to the book. So each chapter, as it goes through chronologically, the events, what you hear is each man's memoir, just related to that detail. So when you pick up a chapter, it's like listening to the men themselves sitting down and discussing that specific period of history.
Wow. Now this is a huge time investment. We're talking about over 10 years. Started in 1994. What prompted you to start the book at that time?
The 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. Irv and I had been talking about this over the years, Irv Jr. And we finally decided we had a good product here. American Prisoners of War, the Battle of Bulge, Dresden, Kurt Vonnegut. We really need to do something with this. So we started hunting the men down. One of the guys had kept a roster after the war with names and addresses. You know, one of these, write your name and address down, we'll get together after the war, even though they never did. And starting from that, we spent countless hours looking through the internet, newspapers, military records, telephone calls. We had astronomical telephone bills. And we finally were able to locate a considerable number of men and get them to talk to us.
So 1994 is the reunion of men captured the Battle of Bulge.
That was the reunion of the Stalag 4B.
Correct.
Right.
Now, at that time, Heidi, did you know that your father was one of the POWs in Slaughterhouse Five?
I knew he was a prisoner of war. I knew he had once or twice mentioned Dresden, but I did not really know what that meant. So, and the same as my brother. My brother, too, growing up, my father had mentioned he was in the service, he was a prisoner of war. We didn't understand that. And there were a couple occasions where either at school, my brother had read Slaughterhouse Five in class, or at the university, I'd mentioned to a professor that my father was in Dresden. And they would keep handing us this book, Slaughterhouse Five. And I know for my brother, there was one occasion where he actually brought the book out and showed my father. And the only comment my father would make was that I was at a slaughterhouse, and he would say nothing more. So that was literally back in like 1970s. So we knew my dad was a prisoner. We knew he had something to do with Dresden, but we had no idea of really what that meant up until this project began in 1994.
So let me be sure I understand what you're saying. Your father then lived for about 50 years, is that right, without ever talking about his experience in World War II, and particularly in
in
Dresden during the bombing. You never knew he was there.
No.
You read Slaughterhouse Five, the novel. He
I
saw
had-
you reading it. He never talked. He never talked to your mother.
No, my mother did not know. That was after 40 years of marriage. Until this project began, my mother did not know what happened. She knew he was a prisoner, captured in the Battle of the Bulge. That was it. And the day she actually read the memoir that he put together, she cried. She cried. I think one of the things that bothered her the most was when she read that he ate raw horse meat on the road to liberation. And he kind of lied to her. He said, no, we actually barbecued it. That wasn't true. He just wanted, it was his nature to keep silent, to keep quiet about these details, because he knew they might trouble us.
And then it was that reunion, these men getting together after 50 years, that your father and others started for the first time in their
Right.
lives then
Yeah.
to talk about the experience. Is that?
I think it was gaining the confidence of my brother, for one, and also Frank as a veteran. They felt there's a sort of camaraderie among veterans that they felt comfortable in speaking with him about these very graphic, horrific details.
Let's review a little, some basic facts of history in case people aren't familiar with World War II. What's the relationship between the Battle of the Bulge and the men who were held prisoner in Slaughterhouse Five in Dresden?
Well, on December 16th, 1944, the Nazis launched a last-ditch effort to try and salvage the war for them. And during a 3-day battle, they surrounded an entire division, in this case the 106th Infantry Division. And they forced the surrender of 7,000 men, one of the largest surrenders of American forces. These men were all sent to various prison camps in Germany. A large number were sent to Stalag 4B, south of Berlin. And then they were just processed in the camp like regular prisoners. But then one day in mid-January, the Germans came by and in typical military fashion picked 150 volunteers to go to Dresden on a work detail. You know, you.
Just randomly?
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow.
And they shipped them down to Dresden. And the only place they could be housed was in the public slaughterhouse. It was a fenced-in area. It had buildings that could shelter them from the elements. And that's where they kept them for a month, doing various work details, clearing rubble, working in a malt factory, working in a factory that made vitamins for pregnant women, unloading rail cars.
And they were shipped there when?
In mid-January 1945.
And when was the city bombed?
February 13th,
February 13th.
February 13th, 1945.
So-
Ironically, Shrove Tuesday and Ash Wednesday.
So they were there for about a month before the bombing,
Yes.
and then also for maybe a month afterwards.
2 months afterwards.
2 months afterwards. Were any of the men killed in the bombing?
No, all the men survived the bombing. 4 of them, out of the 150, 4 of them ultimately did not come back. 1 man was executed for plundering. 1 man died of malnutrition and just basically gave up. 1 man was killed 3 days after the war ended when an Italian prisoner of war picked up a weapon and it discharged. And another man was killed when the Russians strafed the column.
So there were roughly 150 that were held captive in Slaughterhouse Five, is
Yes.
that correct? How many men did you actually interview for the book?
We were able to locate and interview 68 men that were still alive.
Wow.
Another 20 next of kin we spoke with. There were 5 men we located who did not wish to talk to us for a variety of reasons. And about 68 had died before we even started the project. As of today, there's 19 still alive.
Including your father.
Right.
Yes.
Many of these men had never talked about this experience, including your father. He
Right.
hadn't talked about it. And presumably you were contacting them just sort of out of the blue to ask them questions about this horrific part of their lives. How did they respond to you? What was that like, that first contact that you made with?
Well, it actually went very well. And I used Heidi's dad as the hook. Well, my father-in-law was there with you. And then they would start talking.
They remembered him too.
Yeah.
He used to draw cartoons when he could get paper or even a little bit of charcoal. So he'd draw cartoons of the men, sometimes cartoons of the German guards. So, you know, maybe the name Irvin Szpek didn't connect always, but once they mentioned the cartoonist, then the men would kind of open up. Yeah, we remembered him. And then they'd start to share slowly some of those memories.
And as they got older, I found over the years dealing with POWs that as they got older, they need to talk about this because it's been bottled up inside them for 50, 60 years. And all of the men, to a man, whether they admit it or not, are suffering from some form of PTSD because of this.
PT?
Post-traumatic stress disorder. It used to be called neuroses, shell shock. And it is actually good for them to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And when they talk to us on the phone, suddenly there's family members calling us. I never heard that story in 50 years. Can you send me a copy of the tape? My dad never talked about this. They were shocked.
And then for many, it was a healing process they found in sharing these memories.
But you say there were some that never would.
There were 5 of them that did not want to speak with us at all.
Did they write anything? Did they?
No. They just said, please don't, thank you for contacting me. I really don't want to talk about it. Please don't call me again. And I respected that.
Mm-hmm. Clearly, this experience in Slaughterhouse Five was horrific for these men. They obviously repressed it for 50 years and didn't want to confront it. And what was so horrific about the experience?
I can take that. If you look at the stories of other POWs who were kept, who the Germans kept, they were kept in different circumstances. When these 150 men were taken away from Stalag 4B in Mühlberg and put into the slaughterhouse, first of all, they were the only Americans, at least they knew of, in a city that was of all Germans, a lot of German refugees. So first of all, they felt isolated. They already were, many of them were sick with dysentery, malnutrition. The level of food, the amount of food they got was far less than, say, if they had not been chosen for this work detail. So their situation in which they lived was different. It was harsher. And then what really changed, though, is the bombing of Dresden. In that bombing, first they were underground, not knowing exactly what was happening above. When they came out to witness that the city was basically decimated by the firebombing, again their life changed, not just in recognizing they survive, but now their work duties would change. Instead of working in, say, a malt factory or a vitamin factory, they would now be working on what Vonnegut called body mining. So for the next 2 months, they basically were taken outside of Dresden, housed in a South African camp, and every day before dawn, they would be marched maybe over 2 miles into the city where they would spend the whole day taking bodies out of the rubble. And they did this for 2 months into the night, and the men talk, and that's one thing I remember my father when he did speak. He spoke about what was the most hard to handle were the bodies of children. And remember, many of these children had on their costumes from Shrove Tuesday. So they're pulling these children out of these buildings, they're stacking them like cords of wood, and then often having to burn them. The men would talk about how in many cases the bodies would fall apart. And in a sense, they almost would become indifferent. They almost would try to cease to be a human themselves in order to withstand this. And they did this for 2 months, at which point then as the Russians advanced, they were taken out of Dresden. And the situation still became difficult because nobody came looking for them. They had to come looking for American lines. So I think that's the nature of the horror in seeing what happened to the German people, and that the Germans who did survive looked to them as, you are guilty. You are the ones who brought this upon our city. Yeah.
In the book, do you discuss at all any sort of themes, things that you learned, sort of overarching themes from the recollections, themes about war in general, or about World War II specifically, or about the need to remember or forget?
Right.
And what do we learn? What kind of themes emerge?
Okay, I'll have a few things and then I can add to it. I guess I also teach about, many know courses on the Holocaust, and in those courses there's themes of survival, of having to preserve a sense of humanity, not cross that line where you in a sense become a thing, just a living organism. And what you do find, it's not that we discuss it, it's that when you read the words of the men, they talk about how they are trying to preserve their sense of humanity. And often it may be by maintaining a buddy system, that you'll agree, okay, if I find something to eat, I'll share it with you. You find something to eat, I'll share it with you. So that theme emerges in the men's writing, that they fought against deep odds to maintain their sense of humanity. And somewhere in there, they often say it's like a thread of faith. Their belief, not in any specific religious aspect, but in a greater good of humanity, that emerges in their words themselves. Yeah. Yeah, I think you had some thoughts. Yeah.
I came away with trying to remember that these were all 18, 19, 20-year-old. A few men were older, but most of these were young men. That division was the youngest division in the Army. And you thrust 18, 20, 21-year-olds into a situation that no human being should have to go through. And they came back to this country, and a lot of the World War II veterans were treated poorly by the country. All the war's over. Get on with your life. Oh, you were prisoners. Why did you let them take you alive? Why didn't you, save the last bullet for yourself? So they kept quiet about it. But you also have to remember that, and this transgresses time. The Korean War veterans, the Vietnam generation, they all went to war to do the dirty work for your country. They didn't want to. They were told you had to. And comes back and you look at how they were treated over the years, and this country could have done a lot better job of treating their veterans. Thankfully now it's changed because they realize that veterans from the other wars were treated poorly. But the World War II generation was unique because they came back not wanting a handout from the government. This was our job, we did it. They want to get on with their lives. And you find that in a lot of the prisoners. They don't regret their time. A lot of the guys said they would have done it again. They would have gone to war again to save the country. They just would have preferred to keep some of the months as a prisoner out of the situation. But the overall theme is we have to take care of these people that we send off to war. And just coming home and patching up an outward wound, as the title of the book says, Shadows, is not the answer. Because these men are going to have shadows the rest of their lives. This war is going to hang on them until the day they die. And it affects their family.
Has the experience of writing the book changed your lives?
I think personally for me, or clearly for myself and for my brother, I understand my father in a better way than I did growing up. Growing up, we had sort of poor circumstances, but we got by. But my father never complained. He never complained if there was, say, spam on the table every night. He never complained if he had to work 2 jobs, a job and a half. Nothing really seemed to trouble him. He never got angry, maybe even at times when I thought, why isn't Dad doing something to my brothers who might have been troublemakers at the time? But I understand his work ethic now. I understand his character. And from that, and I guess I also deeply respect him for, as painful as it was for him, for not sharing these memories, because some of the children and spouses, the wives who did know, their lives were difficult. It made growing up for their children hard, and our father spared us that pain to give us a good childhood. Yeah.
There's going to be a couple examples in the book where one daughter said they never had a good Christmas. Because always around Christmas time, which was the anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, all their father would talk about was the battle, the bombing of Dresden, and the execution of one of the prisoners. She never remembers a good Christmas growing up. Another man, I spoke with his brother. He drank himself to death after the war. He couldn't handle it. And he got no help from anybody. Even when he wanted to talk about it, nobody wanted to listen.
What would one see today if one went to Dresden and to the slaughterhouse? Is it still there?
Yeah, the slaughterhouse is still there. It has been renovated as a music and convention center. But if you ask, most of the people who work there will still take you to where the below-ground bomb shelter was kept. Well, a bomb shelter was sort of like a meat locker, but there's a plaque outside of it, a bronze plaque that remembers that on this day, February 13th, 14th, 1945, so many Americans were kept here, as well as the Germans. So there still is that historical aspect there. Otherwise, the rest of the city is generally back to its beautiful state of, as it's called, the Florence on the Elbe. So you'll see the churches, the palace, but you won't see the ruins of war as they were at that time.
In addition to documenting the stories of the POWs in Slaughterhouse Five, were there other kinds of questions that you tried to answer with your research?
Well, we tried to get the men to give their opinion as to whether the bombing of Dresden was necessary or justified. And except for 2 or 3 men who said, well, they started the war, they had it coming, most of the men said no. They knew the war was close to ending. They knew the Russians were only 50 miles away, and they thought the whole bombing of the city was totally unnecessary. Over the years, we found the men seemed to think that, one, it was Churchill's revenge for Coventry, bombing of Coventry, and the other was Churchill and Roosevelt showing Stalin that this is what could happen to your cities if you don't behave after the war was over, because they already knew what Stalin was intending to do. But almost to a man, they thought it was totally unnecessary because the city, other than being a rail center for troops being funneled to the Russian front, it had no real military industry of any major sort. And it was swollen with 500,000 refugees fleeing the Russians. So they all thought it was totally unnecessary. Kurt Vonnegut made an interesting comment in one of his talks on TV once. Kurt said that the bombing of Dresden did not end the war 1 millisecond earlier than had it not occurred. And he said he thought it was totally unnecessary. And then he went on to say that he was the only person that ever made money off the bombing of Dresden. He said he made about $5 for every corpse through his book and his lectures.
Wow. Didn't you also, wasn't there a search to find the site of a particular grave?
Yes. One man named Michael Pelea was unfortunately executed for stealing food. The Germans called it plundering. Most of the men were starving, so they would steal whatever they could. But as long as they ate it in the basements, the guards looked the other way. Pelea made the mistake of bringing it out. He got caught, and they court-martialed him and shot him as an example. The family never knew what happened to him. All they got was the telegram from the War Department saying, your son was killed while a prisoner of war. Well, we uncovered what really happened to him, and we narrowed it down to a several hundred-meter area where he was buried, enough that the Army sent a team to dig. But they couldn't find him, and they said if we find more information, they'll go back. But we contacted his brother in 1995 and told his brother what happened, and the family was shocked. They had never known what happened to their son. His mother and father died without knowing the true story. And it took his brother about a month to get up enough courage to tell the rest of the family. He didn't know if he should or not. Now they're happy we told them because they know what happened to their son or their brother finally.
Well, Heidi, Frank, I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for sharing your personal experiences and your project and the stories of these men held captive in Slaughterhouse Five. And thank you for tuning in. See you next time on Arts and Humanities, Art Central.